Hi everyone, my name is Cynthia. Let's talk books. And today I want to talk about one book. I'm finally getting on with my series, which started about a year ago, on reading the French classics. And this month I read Sweet Française by Irène Némirovsky. So Sweet Française is more of a modern classic. And it is a novel that when it was published caused a lot of hoopla, a lot of controversy because of its portrayal of the behavior of French people during World War II. So World War II is a subject that I teach in class. It's one of my research and interest topics. So I sometimes am careful with the books I read that are set in World War II, because, especially in France, because I kind of know too much. And sometimes that can hinder the reading experience. But this is a book that I've been meaning to read for years and years, and I can't believe that it is not until now that I've read it. If you don't know, I want to give you a little bit of background about the role and the place of France during World War II. So first off, the French were occupied by the Germans during World War II. So it was actually split in two. So the northern part of France was directly occupied by the German military, whereas the southern part of France, and hopefully you'll be seeing a map up here, was actually allowed to form its own government and was pretty autonomous. Yes, ultimately they answered to the Nazis, but the Nazis kind of let the French do whatever they were going to do in the south of France. So the government in the south of France ends up being the Vichy government, led by Maréchal Pétain, who was the one who signed the armistice with Hitler to kind of end France's participation in the war. That didn't fully end French participation in the war. Charles de Gaulle ended up flying out to England. He was really a nobody in the French military, but he ends up making his name during World War II because he, with the support of the British, declares himself the leader of the Free French from Britain, and there were some French troops and French politicians that had managed to make their way to Britain, and so there is a kind of shadow kind of French government, a free French government that participates in World War II. So, like for example, the troops that eventually liberate Paris are the American troops, but they allow the French troops to enter first, and to basically declare that the Paris and the France was liberated by the French. Thus begins, at the very end of World War II, the myth of French resistance. The myth of French resistance says that the French nation, that the French people resisted Nazi occupation, resisted the whole time, right? That France is a nation of resistance and victims of Nazi aggression. That is not the whole story. By the end of the war, yes, the French resistance groups ballooned in membership, but right off the bat, the French resistance was actually really small in numbers. Only people that were being kind of directly attacked by the Nazis, that had to go into hiding, ended up being those initial members of the French resistance. Now, was there an actual legit French resistance in France? Yes. Did most people resist? No. Where you can put most French people's actions during World War II is either under accommodation or collaboration. One of the things that Sweet Française does really well is shows some of that French collaboration and accommodation, and it makes people really uncomfortable when you focus on that aspect. So the book itself is divided into two sections, two kind of short stories that are not really, they're thematically related, but character and story-wise are not that related. The first section is called Storm in June, and it deals with the evacuation of Paris when it becomes clear that the French are losing, the German troops are advancing, and nobody is stopping their march into Paris. Right? And what it does really beautifully, I think, is capture the chaos that was the process of evacuating Paris. Some people had managed to leave Paris before that, but really most Parisians didn't think the German troops were ever going to make it to Paris. They had it during World War I. The troops had entrenched themselves in northern France, and so everybody thought that the Germans were going to be stopped before reaching Paris. So basically, most people waited until the Germans were right at the doors of Paris to leave. And so when you have thousands of people trying to leave a major world capital at the same time, like you can imagine, it was extremely chaotic. So that is shown here very beautifully, I thought, the way that people who were trying to leave Paris end up having to walk because they run out of gas or they run out of resources, the way they're living off the land and incredibly dependent on the generosity of the people in the countryside. So the French countryside outside of Paris is really largely devastated by the evacuation and kind of all these refugees coming out of Paris. One of the key themes in the book and in both stories in the book is a critique of the upper classes in France. Némirovsky spends a lot of time focusing on individuals and families that are members of the elite families of France, and basically how they totally miscalculate when and how they need to evacuate, and as a result hurt people. They hurt people in the lower and working classes that work for them and that are dependent on them. We follow in this first half for large chunks one family, the Perican family. And one of the stories that stood out to me was the oldest Perican son, who is a Catholic priest. And he is in charge of evacuating a bunch of kids. It was quite powerful. And what I really saw in her description of the evacuations is a condemnation of people's behavior, especially the upper classes. Like she says, people behaved in the worst ways, in the worst, more self-interested ways. Some people were incredibly generous, and that was mainly the working class and peasant class, but by and large, she says she's really focusing on people's terrible behaviors. And the fact, I think, ultimately, one of the arguments she's making with this story is that having died during the war, even if you died heroically, did not mean you were a good person. People were kind of made into these kind of saints and heroes, but they really were not. All right, on to the second story. The second story, Dolce, takes place years into the occupation in a village on the border of the demarcation line between Vichy France and then the directly occupied Somme. So this is years into occupation, where French families were forced to quarter German soldiers to let them live in their houses. And it kind of deals with how people's behavior towards and with these German, sometimes officers, German soldiers, how it developed. Basically, what she's analyzing is how collaboration occurred here, right? And that one of the reasons it was occurring was because Germans represented access to food, to resources, and women especially found that, by having sexual and romantic relationships with the Germans, that they were able to survive the war. And from there, you can make your own assessment and your own judgment. But I think Némirovsky is judging them quite harshly and not unjustly necessarily. I think a lot of those women are going to end up getting punished at the end of the war in a very sexist, really horrible way. But I think at least what she's describing here felt very real. Wealthy French people in the second story come up terrible. They're hoarding food, they're hoarding resources, and as a result, villagers are dying and experiencing hardship when it might not have been necessary. At the same time, she shows how human a lot of the German soldiers became to the families that were hosting them and to the towns that were hosting them. They were living with them, eating with them, and that you almost couldn't help but connect with the German soldiers themselves, who were there on orders and weren't necessarily Nazis, but also they were not going to downplay their victory. And that, I think, she did beautifully. I think that the way she humanizes the soldiers, right? There'll be a few pages of like going into the soldier's background, his interactions with the French locals, and then all of a sudden you get a glimpse of, yeah, all right, before you fall in love with this German soldier, these are all the horrible things that he's also doing. Like, she switches from taking us from that human aspect to then, boom, they can also be ruthless and they will do anything to protect themselves and to protect their victory. And I found that really quite brilliant. And she shows this kind of perspective of the German soldiers in France, and then how, the German villagers and kind of wrestle with that, and that basically they make a choice. They make a choice to accommodate, to collaborate with the Germans, and that those actions should be criticized. That was kind of one of the best elements in this book. So I really enjoyed this book. Hopefully you can tell. Intellectually, it was very stimulating. It also actually really reminded me of another book that I read last year, and that was The Nightingale. That book, that author, I am 100% sure read Sweet Française, because a lot of the themes, a lot of the descriptions, all the patterns in the story are the same. And I really enjoyed The Nightingale for the emotional impact it had, but I need to put in here that this Sweet Française is more historically accurate. The Nightingale really focuses on kind of the story of resistance and fighting back, whereas Sweet Française is telling you, no, those were exceptions. The fighting back, the resisting was an exception. Most people accommodated or collaborated, and you see that more clearly here, while you still get the impact of kind of the evacuation of Paris and the hardships of everyday life in an occupied country during World War II. So for that, I think this is a much better book. However, this book was a draft. Irène Némirovsky was a Jewish woman who had escaped to France. And it always breaks my heart when I read that in somebody's biography, because I know they probably died. The minute I read that, I know they probably died, because most of the Jews in France never survived the Holocaust. And that, I kind of wish there was more of that in here, but of course she couldn't write that, because the Jews in France, first foreign Jews and then French Jews, largely get deported to concentration camps. And it was not an order given by Hitler, it was not an order from the Nazi regime, from the German military. This was actions taken by the French government itself. The French police had kept record of all the Jews in France. They had lists with names and addresses, and they were the ones who knocked on people's doors and took people out of their homes, and then handed them over to the Nazis to be killed in the death camps. So this is where I say it is really important when we talk about World War II and France's role in the World War II to emphasize that this was not a nation of resistance, that the Vichy government was responsible for the death of a majority of Jews in France at the time, and that it needs to take responsibility for it, and it has largely done, by the way. The generation of World War II kind of fed the myth of French resistance, but the next generation of the 60s and 70s kind of looked back at the actions of their parents during the war, and they were the ones who kind of made sure that responsibility for that was taken. Now, this is an incredibly important topic, because currently in France, in the political debates, this tends to come back up. In the last election in 2016, Macron ran against Marine Le Pen. Marine Le Pen, on several occasions, talked about how the idea of collaboration was wrong, and that the French resisted, and that was the history that needed to be told. And that is just flat out wrong. To me, as historian of France, it's really important to highlight that and to make sure that people aren't co-opting and trying to twist history that has been proven for decades now. I get very passionate about this topic because it's something that I care very much about. But I was talking about critiques of Némirovsky. So one thing you won't see here is that you won't see the treatment of the Jews in France in here, and I think that is an important part of the history that is missing in this book. It also, I think, very much reads like a draft. Like, a lot of people praise it and love this story, and I think it deserves all of that, but it also could use a little bit more polishing, I think. Some of the writing, the characterization, a lot of these things I think need a little bit more polishing. That, or maybe some of it was the translator. But I actually think the translator did what sounded like a really decent job through most of this story. At the end, they show you actually some of the pages, the drafting that Némirovsky did. You won't be able to see that clearly in here, but she was working on this and meant it to be part of a larger project that was never complete because she was murdered in a concentration camp. So I do recommend this if you're interested in World War II books and books set in World War II France. I think this is a very good one. Don't expect it to take you on the same kind of emotional journey that books like All the Light We Cannot See and The Nightingale take you on. Like, this is not a story in which you're going to follow people's lives and you're really going to want to root for them. You're basically not. But you're going to get an in-depth analysis of people's lives, people's characters, and the kind of the good, the bad, and all the in-between that makes up people living in an occupied country during World War II. So that is my pitch. I will continue with my Reading the French Classics series, so keep an eye out for that. But for today, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!